It is our tremendous honor today to be speaking with Dr. Craig Keener. Dr. Keener earned his PhD degree from Duke University in 1991 and is currently Professor of New Testament Studies at Asbury Theological Seminary. He is the author of many books, including the IVP Bible Background Commentary, which is sold in its various forms, over 500,000 copies. Also author of The Historical Jesus of the Gospels and the monumental 4-volume Acts, an exegetical commentary from Baker Academic Press. Today's book, the book that we'll be discussing today, is a 2-volume set, Miracles, the Credibility of the New Testament Accounts, also available from Baker Academic. Dr. Keener, thank you for being with us today.
It's my privilege.
Dr. Keener, as we understand from the introduction of this text, Miracles, this 2-volume set work began as a footnote to your larger Acts and exegetical commentary. Now, other scholars have approached the book of Acts from a standpoint of faith and understood that the works there reported are historical events, but they didn't necessarily mount an 1,100-page study to demonstrate that miracles in the book of Acts should be accepted as historical accounts. What was it, if you'd be willing to share, was your motivation for launching this study?
I think because I had been an atheist before my conversion, I was kind of sensitive to the questions that skeptics raise. And so I wanted to at least, sometimes people were saying these were just legends that arose over the process of time. And I wanted to show that you could have eyewitness accounts, firsthand accounts that recount the same kinds of events and experiences that we have in the Gospels and Acts. And so I thought I could do that in a footnote, because I knew of people who'd experienced these things. I'd experienced some myself, not as dramatic as some of the others. But I thought, well, I'll just find some works that summarize these. But in the process, I kept finding more and more works before I found any that summarized a large number of them. And the footnote grew and grew, and wasn't intended to be 1,100 pages, but it's good it got published when it did, or it would have been even longer.
Excellent. Dr. Keener, in your book, Miracles, the Credibility of the New Testament Accounts, you place the miracle stories of Jesus and the Gospels in their ancient context and compare them to extra-canonical accounts of miracles, both ancient and modern. First of all, in what ways are the miracle accounts of Jesus and the apostles perhaps different from those of other miracle workers in antiquity?
I wanted to show that sometimes people just lump them together because they're considered supernatural, so that, actually it's modern Western anti-supernaturalism that's idiosyncratic culturally. Most cultures in the world believe in some sort of extra human, whether it's divine or something else, power for healing and what we call miracles. So, and that's been true throughout history. So if you actually compare some of the accounts of ancient healers among Greeks and Romans, for example, some of these are mythical healers of the distant past, like Asclepius, where, it's so many centuries earlier, we don't have that much knowledge of, whether they even existed, as opposed to first-generation reports and sometimes eyewitness reports we have about Jesus or his disciples in the Gospels and Acts. And also we have, you compare some of these other accounts. You have like a Hyperborean magician flying on a magic arrow. You can see that in the New Testament. Invisibility, well, that's not quite so problematic. Then heroes showing their golden thighs, or you have a lot of love magic, seducing people away from their spouses and things like that. You have a 57-year nap. So Rip Van Winkle, Washington Irving was somewhat original, but he had precursors. You have a continual fast. You have Pythagoras teaching in 2 places at one time. You have a lot of things. These are not the New Testament. The bulk of the reports, not all of them, but the bulk of them are about healings and deliverances, and that shows you also something that God cares about. Now you do have the Gentile healing shrines, like of Asclepius. And there we do have sometimes contemporary accounts of people who had recoveries, sometimes extraordinary recoveries, however you explain that, whether, in some cases we might say psychosomatic, in some cases we may look for spiritual explanations for those things. But we don't have like a traveling sage as a healer. We have, some traveling magicians who did magic tricks and things like that. But in terms of, the closest parallel we have among Gentiles are the stories about Apollonius of Tyana, and these are recorded in the 3rd century by Philostratus. Now, what's striking about that is the Christian stories were widespread by that point. So it makes much more historical sense to say that the stories of Apollonius were influenced by the Christian stories that were already circulating, rather than to say that the 1st century Gospels were influenced by a work that wouldn't yet be written for over a century. Now, there are Jewish parallels. Honi, the circle drawer, known in Josephus as Onias, and also Hanina ben Dosa. He comes a little bit later, but he comes later than the 1st century. Most of our miracle stories about them actually appear about half a millennium after they lived. But I don't doubt that, I think there's a core to them. I think that God probably did answer some of their prayers. But the model for them, I think, was often the same model we have in the New Testament. And they were especially known for praying for rain to fall. But their model, I think, is especially the model we have explicitly and often implicitly in the New Testament, that Jesus could draw on the model of Elijah and Elisha. And that's not just a model that the gospel writers could draw on, that's something Jesus could draw on as well. So I think those parallels are much closer than any parallels that we have in pagan literature or larger Greco-Roman literature.
Excellent. One of the things that many scholars have commented on about your scholarship is the thoroughness that you work through the Greco-Roman sources. How would you characterize the difference between some of these ancient Greco-Roman stories about miracles and what we find in the Bible?
Well, some of this I've already mentioned, but there are also, the difference in terms of the accounts of a particular healer, not people recovering in healing shrines, but of a particular healer, the accounts are really quite different. You have some stories in the Gentile world about people who lived many hundreds of years before. Eyewitnesses are all dead. No direct lineage back to any written sources that we know of. Whereas in the case of Jesus, we're talking about 1st generation sources. Virtually all scholars agree that Mark was written within a generation of Jesus' public ministry. Some date it a little bit earlier, but usually most scholars date it between 64 and 75, and on average about 70 among critical scholars. I tend to date it around 64, but whatever. Mark is within a generation of Jesus' public ministry, and yet about 1/3 of Mark's gospel consists of miracle stories. Healings and exorcisms. Now, that's quite extraordinary when you consider that Mark's genre is that of an ancient biography. Ancient biographies within a generation or two normally were just full of historical information, accurate historical information about the person. I've actually tested this by going back and looking at some ancient biographies from within that span of time and comparing them with other historical sources, and it's just clear that they saw their work as reporting historical information. Well, in the case of the Gospels, we have these reports about Jesus. They're in what scholars consider every layer of gospel tradition. Scholars who talk about Mark, who talk about shared source between Matthew and Luke. That's not all scholars, but for the scholars who hold that, including myself, and then for other sources. And it's in every layer of that. In that shared material between Matthew and Luke, which is often considered the earliest of the gospel sources, certainly within that first generation. You have Jesus sending a message to John the Baptist and talking about all these different categories of miracles he's been working: healing the blind, healing the deaf, raising the dead, cleansing the lepers, dramatic, visible miracles in many cases. And, it's hard to categorize all this as psychosomatic, especially being dead is usually not psychosomatic. But anyway, but then you have in the book of Acts, where the majority of scholars think that the we in the book of Acts represents an eyewitness source. I think it also represents the author himself, Luke. But in any case, whatever view scholars hold on that, most scholars think that it represents an eyewitness. And where is the eyewitness? I mean, the eyewitness is with Paul when Eutychus falls out the window in Acts chapter 20 and gets raised. The eyewitness is with Paul in Acts chapter 28, I think it's around verses 8 and 9, where people are just streaming to Paul on the island of Malta, and he's praying for them and they're getting healed. And so we have eyewitness accounts. Paul in 2 Corinthians 12:12 talks to the Corinthians and appeals to their eyewitness knowledge of the miracles and signs and wonders that were performed through him, as well as talking about it elsewhere and talking about these things happening within the churches in 1 Corinthians 12, Galatians 3, his own ministry, saying these things happen regularly in Romans 15:19. But in 2 Corinthians 12:12, he actually appeals to their eyewitness knowledge of what, the miracles that were done through his ministry. We have other sources as well. By the way, the detractors of early Christianity didn't deny that Jesus performed miracles. The rabbis who didn't agree with Christianity, and Celsus in the late 2nd century, who attacked Christianity, they spoke of, he did miracles. We just believe he did them by sorcery. But they couldn't deny that he did miracles. In fact, some of the later rabbis talked about some of his followers doing miracles. One story, a rabbi was on his deathbed and said, there's a follower of Jesus at the door. Let him in. Let him pray for me. So we have that, and perhaps most compellingly, Josephus, the Jewish historian in the 1st century, in his Antiquities, I think it's 1863 and 64, the original form of that, he talks about Jesus as a sage who was a worker of wonders, using the same term that's used for another sage, Elisha. Elsewhere in Josephus talks about him working wonders, namely miracles. So even people who weren't Christians acknowledged Jesus as a miracle worker. And for that reason, most historical Jesus scholars today, whether they actually believe in real miracles, divine activity or not, acknowledge that Jesus was experienced by his contemporaries as a miracle worker.
Dr. Keener, thank you for that. Dr. Keener, would you be willing to respond to David Hume's classic critique of miracles? And one version of that critique would be, a miracle is the breaking of the laws of nature or a violation of the laws of nature, and we construct the laws of nature based on empirical observation. So a miracle is impossible by definition, because even if we were to experience something extraordinary to us, it would only help revise our understandings of the laws of nature. How do you respond?
There are actually two major parts of Hume's argument, although I think that they're related. But the first part is the one about miracles as violations of the laws of nature. Now, nobody up until that time had called them violations of the laws of nature. It sounds like you're breaking a law, whereas theists actually don't understand God is breaking those laws, but God is ordering those laws, and God is free to adjust them. Isaac Newton, on whom Hume had to depend on ideas of laws of miracles. I mean, Isaac Newton and the early Newtonians all believed in miracles. They didn't deny miracles. They said, the universe, God set it up in an orderly way, but God is not bound by those rules. Today, also, we usually understand laws of nature descriptively rather than prescriptively. It's not telling you what can't happen. Now, in terms of causation, we try to come up with hypotheses for the best cause for something. Hume is just a priori ruling out a theistic explanation. If you a priori say, well, you can't use God as an explanation, then you're going to look somewhere else for an explanation. But sometimes the evidence, I think, is very strong that God is the best explanation. I mean, Hume talks about somebody being raised from the dead who's, eventually, sometimes people will raise the bar of evidence. They say, give me somebody raised from the dead. You give them that evidence, and then they raise the bar higher. And, eventually they're talking about, if God writes his name in the sky, and they're asking for things that God is not going to stoop down and give. I mean, he's already done so much. But there's so much evidence. And I can maybe, well, I'll just give one example of that. I mean, unless we're burying a lot of people prematurely, we shouldn't expect that most of us know somebody who just was misdiagnosed as dead and happened to resuscitate a little while later. I mean, maybe we'd say maybe 1 chance in 10 that we'd know somebody like that, 1 chance in 100, even if it's as high as 1 chance in 10. When I started talking with friends in my own circle, my circle and my wife's circle, we knew about 10 people. So, I mean, if it's 1 chance in 10, the odds of me finding 10 in my immediate circle is something like 1 in 10 to the 10th power, 1 in 10 billion or so. And I mean, that's higher than the world's population. And I just happen to be writing this book, and I know other people who have the same sphere of experience. So, I mean, sometimes, you're saying, well, it's just a coincidence, but sometimes there are other explanations that are more compelling, that are more probable than coincidence. And Hume's second argument is actually the argument on which I think he bases his argument from nature, and that is that we don't have any reliable eyewitnesses for miracles. Now, if somebody claims to be a witness for miracles, he'd probably consider them unreliable. So there's a major circularity in his argument, and that's actually one of the major things that my book was meant to challenge, was just showing we have lots of credible eyewitnesses. We can't say every claim to a miracle, of which statistically it's been shown we have hundreds of millions of those claims around the world today, but we can't say all of those are actual miracles. We don't, well, I think none of us would say those are all actual miracles. At the same time, we have many credible eyewitnesses. We have medical documentation and so on. There was a case where Hume cited actually medical documentation, and this was the healing of Blaise Pascal's niece. Blaise Pascal is kind of the father of the modern computer, a brilliant mathematician, and briefly a theologian before he passed away. But his niece was healed of a stinky, long-term running eyesore, and it was public. The healing was public. Now, most of us today wouldn't agree with how it happened. I mean, she was touched with the holy thorn from Jesus' crown. It was one of the many relics that was circulating at that time. I mean, I think I agree with Luther when he said that there were probably enough nails from the Holy Cross circulating to shoe every horse in Saxony. And he complained, how is it that we have 18 of the original 12 apostles buried in Germany, but it was a contact point for her faith, and she was instantly and publicly healed. The Queen Mother of France sent her own physician to check it out, and the physician confirmed this. So Hume actually cites this case and says, well, this one is better documented than anything we have in the Bible. Look, I mean, it's medically documented. It was public. It was visible. Basically all the things he asked for a reliable witness. And he said, well, we know this didn't happen, so why should we believe anything else? What kind of argument is that? I mean, that's the kind of argument for which the phrase non sequitur is created. I mean, that's just a very circular argument.
Dr. Keener, I remember as a teenager in the mid-90s going with a amateur Bible smuggling mission to mainland China, and I had the opportunity of meeting believers from the underground church, some evangelists there, who told us some amazing reports about how they would go to these rural villages and pray for miracles, and God in many cases would respond. They reported even people being raised back from the dead. What is it that we're supposed to learn positively from these miracles? What is God teaching us?
Now, the example you give from China is very interesting, because there was a study done in the year 2000, and someone from within the China Christian Council, which is affiliated with the Three Self Church, suggested that about half of all new conversions in the previous 20 years, so millions of people converting to Christianity over that period, about half of those were due to what they called faith healing experiences. And source from within the underground church, the house church movements at that time, suggested in the rural areas it might be closer to 90%. Now, I have no way to verify those kind of statistics, but we know we're talking about lots of people. These are people coming not from Christian presuppositions, but people who actually, in some cases, had to abandon centuries of certain kinds of tradition to become followers of Jesus. So, and often there's a social price. I mean, in India, you have a lot of people being healed, a lot of them becoming followers of Jesus, and a lot of them not becoming followers of Jesus because of the social price, but still recognizing that Jesus is a healer. So, in the Gospels and Acts, and today, most often, these most dramatic or extraordinary healings are taking place, and other kinds of miracles are taking place as the gospel is going forth, especially in new areas. Now, that's not to say God doesn't answer prayer anywhere else. He does, and I have a number of accounts of that. But they're not always dramatic. I mean, you can have the elders pray the prayer of faith, somebody recovers, or God works through medicine, God works through doctors. We can be grateful for all of that. But sometimes it's dramatic, and that does happen many places, but it especially most often happens when God is getting people's attention for the gospel. And I could give so many examples of that, so many people movements around the world that began with that.
Dr. Keener, would you be willing to share with us what is a biblical theology of signs and wonders?
Sure. In terms of Jesus' ministry, he sends a message to John the Baptist. This is it's in material that Matthew and Luke share, so it's considered some of the earliest tradition, going back to the earliest memories about Jesus, that he sends a message back to John the Baptist. And he says the blind see, the disabled walk, the deaf hear, the lepers are cleansed, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. But the language that he uses in sending that message to John the Baptist also sends another message to John, who is biblically literate and would therefore have known that Jesus was making allusions to Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61. I mean, the language that Jesus frames this message in is about God restoring people in these times. Well, the context of that has to do with the ultimate restoration. God is going to make a new heavens and a new earth. He's going to restore his people and so forth. And so what that suggests is that Jesus was saying, John, I'm not baptizing people with fire, it's true. I'm not doing all the things you expected me to do yet. But these signs are a foretaste of the kingdom. These signs demonstrate God's reign. They demonstrate God's power. They also demonstrate God's character, because most of these miracles were acts of compassion towards the broken. And so I think something we can learn from that, first of all, is God's reign. God is in charge. But secondly, I think we can also learn from that when God heals people, even if he doesn't always answer all of our prayers, but if he answers someone's prayers in a dramatic way, and we look at that, we recognize that's good news for all of us, not just for the person who receives it, because it's a confirmation of God's promise of the coming consummation of the kingdom. So that in the present, we suffer, but we recognize there's coming a day when God is going to heal all the sicknesses. Death is going to be no more. He's going to wipe away every tear from our eyes. So the signs are a foretaste of the kingdom. At the same time, we need to recognize there's something even deeper than miracles. The signs, the foretaste of the kingdom is wonderful. I don't want to play that down at all. At the same time, even deeper than that, in the theology of the Gospels, is the message of the cross. Because in the cross, we see that even in the midst of suffering, in the midst of brokenness, in the midst of injustice, God is still at work to bring about his purposes. God is still faithful. God reigns. And he doesn't always do things the way we expect, but God has a plan, and his plan will not fail.
Dr. Keener, thank you. In your book, Miracles, the Credibility of the New Testaments, you chronicle hundreds of miracle stories from around the world from the contemporary period. Would you be willing to share one or two of these miracle stories that are perhaps most significant to you personally?
Now, the most significant miracle stories and the most significant miracle stories for me may be two separate things, but since you asked for me,
yes.
One of the ones that was kind of I was trying to approach these with the questions in my head. Okay, I used to be an atheist, so coming at this from a skeptical viewpoint, asking hard questions. What are the things that I can do to try to explain this away? Which unfortunately, I'm very good at that. I practiced it too much when I was an atheist, but eventually I came across so much that I wasn't able to explain away that just the burden of proof shifted, because it just was overwhelming. And in one of the cases, and again, there are cases that are medically documented. Something like over half of U.S. physicians surveyed said that they have seen miracles. So there are a lot of things like that. But for me, the turning point especially was when I was interviewing Antoinette Malambe in Congo, and she was sharing a story I'd already heard, but I hadn't heard it from her, the witness. So I didn't have all the details. She explained it to me. She said that when her daughter Therese was about 2 years old, she cried out that she was being bitten by a snake. Her mother got to her, found her not breathing. There was no medical help available in the village. So she strapped Therese to her back, and she ran to a nearby village where family friend Coco Gomo Moise was doing ministry. Coco Moise prayed for the child. She started breathing. The next day she was fine. Therese is now in her 50s. She's about my age. Had no brain damage. She finished her master's degree and so on. But Therese, this was significant to me for a couple reasons. First, I asked Antoinette Malambe, how long was she not breathing? And she had to stop and think to get from this village to that village. She said about 3 hours. Now, I had cases that were much longer than that, but this one really got my attention because Antoinette Malambe is my mother-in-law, and Therese is my sister-in-law. And so, this was like close to home. And not to that one's mother-in-law, but we did confirm the story also with Coco Moise, who was also a witness. That was rather dramatic for me. Now, there's another one where there've been a number where I've been a witness, but where I've experienced it. But one of these was actually when I was helping in a nursing home Bible study. I was still an undergraduate. This was a long time. I had just become a Christian a few years before that, and there was this woman named Barbara. She always said, "I wish I could walk. I wish I could walk." And one day, the Bible study leader, who was a seminary student, walked over to her and did something I would not recommend seminary students do unless you're absolutely sure it's God, because otherwise there could be serious consequences. He grabbed her by the hand and said, "In the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and walk." And lifted her out of the chair and started walking around the room. Now, if faith is a bias, I can't be accused of it in this case, because I thought she was going to fall flat on the floor. And from the look of horror on her face, I think she thought that too. But from then on, Barbara could walk, and she would always say, "I love my Bible study. I love my Bible study." So that gave me a bit of a bias towards believing in miracles. But really the turning point for really saying I need to take these more seriously was when I got the account of my sister-in-law.
Dr. Keener, thank you so much for those rich and very powerful reflections. Thank you. Dr. Keener, you and your wife, Nadine, are engaged in reconciliation work all through Africa. What is the key to biblical reconciliation?
There are a lot of important things about reconciliation, but I think the biggest key for us as believers in Jesus is to recognize that Jesus is Lord. If Jesus matters more to us, if he's more central to us than anything else, then he's got to be more central, and our unity with others who share that commitment has to be more central than any other connection. So that means it's not my ethnicity, it's not my culture, it's not my language, it's not my denomination, it's not my fraternity or sorority, not that I was in one, but none of these other kinds of connections. I mean, it's not to say they don't matter. Obviously, language matters. You have trouble communicating otherwise, and certainly in the United States and in my wife's country, where they had a civil war, ethnically based, ethnicity matters. I mean, there's the reality of racism. We need to talk about justice and all these things. But if Jesus matters more to us than anything else, then we're going to love our brothers and sisters across all these other lines. And if we really love one another across all these other lines, we'll begin to listen to one another, hear one another out, and even if we disagree, even if we don't come to a consensus, we're going to keep loving one another and working together for the kingdom. But often I think our views will change as we really listen to one another.
Dr. Keener, if I may ask one final question in conclusion, and that is this: what would it mean for the church to be united? How would we recognize this unity today? And what is it that we can do to foster Christian unity?
Jesus said, "This is how everyone will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another." And earlier in that chapter, he talked about serving one another, even giving the example of washing the disciples' feet, kind of as a foretaste of him going to the cross. If we love one another, and not just in word, but in deed, in being willing to sacrifice for one another. And that's what we see the early church did in Acts 2:44 and 45. I mean, they 2:41 to 47, you have they're praying together, they're eating meals together, and right and on either side of it, you have people coming to Christ, first from Peter's sermon, and then finally from the way the church is living. But right in the middle of that, you have believers even sharing their possessions. I mean, when Jesus gets your pocketbook, he gets your wallet, that he's really Lord. But we care for one another. Jesus went on in chapter 17 of the same book to talk about that unity being how people would know that he was really sent by the Father. It shows the world. It doesn't mean we always agree on everything. Sometimes we may challenge one another vigorously on points, but it means we love one another enough to be able to hang in there when we disagree, or hang in there when things are inconvenient, or hang in there when somebody needs help. So I think that's the long answer, or a long answer, but the most concise way to say it is just unity is loving one another and serving one another, no matter what.
It has been our extraordinary privilege today to be speaking with Dr. Keener, Professor of New Testament Studies at Asbury Theological Seminary and author of many books, including the book that we've been discussing today, Miracles, the Credibility of the New Testament Accounts. Dr. Keener, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.